In the previous video, we discussed the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus as the best explanation for the following 4 facts. Fact number 1. Jesus was killed by crucifixion. Fact number 2. The tomb of Jesus was found empty. Fact number 3. Various people reported to have interacted with Jesus after he was killed. And fact number 4. Christianity exploded in popularity in an unlikely region. As of right now, the resurrection is the only explanation that adheres to all of the facts and fits the following 5 criteria, such as explanatory scope, which illustrates how many of the facts are accounted for in any single explanation. Next, we have the criteria of explanatory power, which we use to judge explanations based on their ability to explain each fact individually. Thirdly, we have ad hocness, which we use to determine if an explanation is contrived or forced to fit the data instead of being warranted. Our 4th criterion is plausibility, which is when we deliberate about how likely an explanation is given its context. Lastly, we have the test of specificity, to determine if the explanation applies to this specific scenario, or if the explanation could be used to explain almost anything. Most of the naturalistic explanations we will review today fail in more ways than one, especially in regards to the criteria mentioned previously, but I'm only going to name a few in passing. In the meantime, I want you to focus on why these alternative explanations fail, so let's get started. The first alternative we will discuss is called the swoon theory. The swoon theory, also known as the apparent death theory, denies that Jesus died on the cross because, according to the theory, he actually survived his crucifixion. This proposition is in denial about fact number 1, which says that Jesus was killed by crucifixion. Denying fact 1 lowers the swoon theory's explanatory power, and it goes against modern medical knowledge, which simultaneously lowers its plausibility. David Strauss, a 19th century skeptic, argued that a half-dead Jesus could never have convinced anyone he was the risen Lord. If Jesus had survived, but was maimed, limping, and bleeding, the disciples would not have proclaimed him the conqueror of death. Their belief in a glorified, risen Christ suggests Jesus' disciples were convinced of something far more than a revived, wounded man. The early followers of Jesus were willing to die for the belief in his resurrection, not just that he had survived. The Journal of the American Medical Association says the following, and I quote, "Interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge," end quote. It seems that it is a medical impossibility for Jesus to have survived the crucifixion. Roman crucifixion was designed to kill. Roman soldiers themselves were trained killers. Their own lives could depend on completing their assignments, to where Roman law demanded absolute certainty of death before bodies could be released from the cross. Some crucifixion victims even died before reaching the crucifix, because there are 3 different phases to a full Roman crucifixion. In the first stage, the person is scourged, which means they are whipped and abused so thoroughly that some people would die during the beating. We even have accounts where people would have to proceed to the second phase of crucifixion despite their intestines hanging out of them from being brutally lacerated by a flagrum, which is one of the tools the Romans would use to beat the crucifixion victims. The church historian Eusebius of Caesarea recounts in his ecclesiastical history, specifically in Book 4, Chapter 15, a vivid description of scourging, where people's intestines could become exposed from these beatings. We should also remember that Jesus was actually beaten twice. Once by the Jews, and then he was scourged by the Romans, which just adds to the reasons why Jesus died. It was already impressive that Jesus survived the intense beatings, but then he had to go to the cross, which is stage 2 of the full Roman crucifixion process. as Jesus was forcibly pinned to the cross while blood leaked out of him. He likely died hours later due to asphyxiation. But Jesus could have also died by hypovolemic shock, which is when the blood volume in your body drops to the point where your organs fail. Or he could have died by cardiovascular complications, such as heart failure. He could have died by acidosis, which is when your blood becomes acidic because of too much carbon dioxide. Or Jesus could have died by dehydration, physical trauma, or a pulmonary embolism, such as a blood clot in the heart, brain, or lungs. If all that wasn't enough, Roman executioners would ensure your demise by administering a death blow, which was phase 3 of a full Roman crucifixion. The death blow could be accomplished by breaking your legs, lighting you on fire, having wild animals rip you apart or eat you alive, stabbing you in the heart, or taking a hammer and bashing in your skull. There is an early source that says a death blow was given to Jesus, which is probably historical, considering the livelihood of the Romans who crucified Jesus was likely on the line, so they would make sure he was dead. However, we do have a story from Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, where 3 of Josephus's friends were crucified, but they only experienced the first 2 phases of a crucifixion. After it was revealed that these crucifixion victims were friends with Josephus, the men were immediately taken off their crosses and given the best medical care that Rome had to offer, but only one of them barely survived. These men only experienced a fraction of what Jesus went through, because in the case of Jesus, he was beaten by the Jews and then scourged by the Romans, so he got 2 beatings rather than 1. Jesus was then crucified, and then was given a death blow. Even if by some miracle Jesus survived, he would have died shortly thereafter from things like exposure, blood loss, or dehydration. But don't just take my word for it. The vast number of historians say that if we know anything about Jesus of Nazareth, we know that he died by Roman crucifixion under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. The scholar John Dominic Crossan, who was no friend to evangelical Christianity, said the following, and I quote, "Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be. For if no follower of Jesus had written anything for 100 years after his crucifixion, we would still know about him from 2 authors not among his supporters. Their names are Flavius Josephus and Cornelius Tacitus." End quote. Ironically enough, the evidence that we went over declares the apparent death theory dead. The second theory we will dissect is known as the mass hallucination theory, or just the hallucination theory for short, so let's get right into it. The mass hallucination theory essentially states that the people who claimed to have seen Jesus alive after his crucifixion were hallucinating, likely due to grief. This hypothesis does not explain fact number 2, which is the missing body of the empty tomb. So the explanatory scope of this hypothesis is then lowered. And this theory is ad hoc, because we don't have any good reasons to doubt the mental stability of all of the people who say they saw Jesus. This explanation also fails the test of specificity, because somebody could explain almost anything away by saying it was a hallucination without proper justification. It is recorded that people saw Jesus many times and not just once, which destroys grief hallucinations, because the followers of Jesus would have not been grieved after they saw him for the first time, because then they would believe he was alive again. Therefore, their grief would have left, and the hallucinations would have stopped. Yet people kept seeing Jesus, so these experiences could not be due solely to grief hallucinations. According to the scholar Paula Fredrickson, she says, and I quote, "The disciples' conviction that they had seen the risen Christ is part of historical bedrock facts known past doubt. What the disciples saw was not the result of deception or delusion." End quote. I should also clarify that we should not psychoanalyze historical characters. It's hard enough for professionals to psychoanalyze someone who is in front of them. Therefore, for critics who are not trained in this area of psychology to then insist on making psychological claims about these historical characters and their mental states, it seems like these critics are speaking out of turn. When Jesus appeared to individuals and groups at different times, in different places, for different durations, people interacted with him by seeing him, touching him, eating with him, and talking with him. We can imagine that these interactions were as authentic as you catching up with a friend over lunch. There was also a definitive endpoint to these interactions with Jesus, which fits far better in reality than inside of a hallucination. And here's why. It doesn't make sense for everyone to be fine at first, and then suddenly for all of these people to become mentally ill after Jesus died, just for them to all become well again at the same time right after Jesus leaves. And why didn't this happen with other crucified Messiah figures and their followers? This type of evidence destroys the hallucination hypothesis because groups of people cannot share the same hallucination. After all, hallucinations are the product of an individual's own mind. Now, you can have a similar hallucination as someone else, but you cannot share in the same hallucination. Just like how you can have a similar dream as someone else, but you cannot share in the same dream. The type of hallucination that would need to occur for the hallucination theory to work would be akin to multiple people all having not just the same dream, but a shared dream at the same time, where they could all consciously interact with each other within the dream. But what really interests me is the Pharisee named Saul of Tarsus, also known as Paul, who didn't even know Jesus. So why would someone who didn't even know Jesus be affected by these hallucinations, just like how Saul was? A bigger problem for this theory is that Jesus appeared to individuals and groups in different places at different times over a 40-day period, which is not a symptom of hallucinations. Modern psychology tells us that shared hallucinations of the same content at the same time are virtually unheard of. If even two people say that they saw the same hallucination in the same room and describe it similarly, it strongly suggests an external reality, not internal imagination or hallucination. On top of that, hallucinations are projections of what is already in someone's mind. So the idea of one man resurrecting in the middle of history, rather than everyone resurrecting at the end of history, was foreign to Jewish thought. Just like in the modern world, when someone in ancient times witnessed another person's death, and then they had a vision of the deceased person, this was not evidence that the deceased person was now alive, but rather it was evidence that the deceased person is dead, because the person is simply seeing the soul or spirit of the deceased person. These examples are extremely relevant, especially in the Jewish context, because Jesus' followers were Jews, so they wouldn't have believed that a Messiah, A, would die, and B, would be resurrected in the middle of time, instead of everyone being resurrected at the end of time, which was orthodox for their view. On top of that, if they did see Jesus again, they would likely assume that they are just seeing his soul, and that he is at the right hand of power with God in heaven. They would not assume a resurrection. The scholar E.P. Sanders says the following, and I quote, "That Jesus' followers had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact. What the reality was that gave rise to the experiences, I do not know." End quote. A visual hallucination is uncommon. An auditory hallucination is unlikely. A tactile or kinesthetic hallucination that you can touch is extremely improbable. And a hallucination that can prepare you a meal is laughable. But for people to experience all of these at once for days on end, both individually and in groups that contain men, women, friends, enemies, skeptics, believers, and unbelievers, that would be a miracle. on par with the resurrection. Therefore, the evidence deems the hallucination theory a delusion of modern times. The third theory we will be discussing is known as the wrong tomb theory. The wrong tomb theory postulates that people either forgot where they buried Jesus, or that somebody moved his burial place, so when his women followers stumbled upon the empty tomb, they simply made up that Jesus had resurrected. This hypothesis has terribly low explanatory power and explanatory scope, because it does not explain facts 3 or 4, which are about people's interactions with Jesus after his death, nor does it explain the rapid growth of Christianity in one of the least likely places, which would be the place where he was publicly executed. Not to mention, the Jews did not even believe in an end-time resurrection, or that their Messiah would be killed. The atheist Jeffrey Lauder agrees that, quote, "The burial of Jesus by Joseph of Arimathea has a high final probability," end quote. Therefore, it's unlikely that Joseph of Arimathea would have forgotten where his own tomb was, because that was the tomb that Jesus was laid in. It's also improbable that they would move the body so soon after the burial. On top of that, it would also be unlikely that any of the followers of Jesus, including the women, forgot where the tomb was. More importantly, when people come upon an empty tomb, they either assume that no body was ever laid in it, or that somebody moved the body that was in this tomb, but they don't assume that the person got up and walked out of it. They don't automatically assume a resurrection. It's also improbable that, upon seeing an empty tomb, the women would blatantly lie about a resurrection. It's more than likely that if the tomb had been mistaken for another, that the disciples of Jesus would have concluded that he's missing, or that his body had been moved, but not that he was resurrected. If Christianity, however, did start simply by the misidentification of Jesus' tomb, then the opponents of the Christian movement, such as the Jewish and Roman authorities who had direct access to Joseph of Arimathea, could have simply gone to the correct tomb and produced Jesus' body. This could have ended the Christian movement immediately. However, it looks like the followers of Jesus, the Romans, and the Jews all didn't know where Jesus' body went. So the Jewish leaders accused the disciples of stealing the body, which indirectly admits our second fact, which is the empty tomb. This also verifies that the original location of the tomb was known to both friend and foe. But here is the larger problem for this theory. A simple misidentification of a tomb would not lead staunch Jews to a radical change in theology, a global religious movement, or the disciples being willing to die for the fact that they interacted with the resurrected Jesus. Therefore, the evidence shows that the wrong tomb theory fails. Lastly, the fourth theory we will analyze is known as the conspiracy theory. The conspiracy theory assumes that the disciples knew Jesus did not rise from the dead, so they stole the body of Jesus after he was killed, and then they invented the resurrection story to deceive others and start a religious movement. This is not only contrary to the types of people the disciples were, men and women who love truth and strived to live good and upright lives before God, but it also doesn't mesh with the facts. This conjecture has a low plausibility for the following reasons. First-century Jews had a deep reverence for God's name, the Torah, and for truth. Lying about a divine act like resurrection would have been a serious sin in their view. These men were devoted Jews, not opportunistic tricksters. Their writings emphasize truth, repentance, sincerity, and integrity, which contradict the idea of fabricating a scheme such as the conspiracy theory. Plus, this does not explain the disciples' interactions with Jesus. The late skeptical scholar named Gerrit Ludemann said the following, and I quote, "It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ." End quote. Why would the disciples of Jesus, who saw him die, steal his body, and then go on to sincerely believe that Jesus walked, talked, touched, and ate with them? The disciples were so confident in these facts that they went on to get beaten, tortured, and some of them killed for their belief. It seems that if the disciples had a belief that Jesus appeared to them alive, they could have easily visited the place where they laid Jesus' stolen body to assure themselves that Jesus was indeed still dead. As the saying goes, liars make poor martyrs. People die for what they think is true, but if the theory is correct, the disciples died for a known lie. If the disciples stole the body, they were in a position to know if what they were saying about the resurrection was true. So why would they continue to get beaten, tortured, and killed for a lie? The scholar E.P. Sanders notes, and I quote, "I do not regard deliberate fraud as a worthwhile explanation. Many of the people in these lists were to spend the rest of their lives proclaiming that they had seen the risen Lord, and several of them would die for their cause." End quote. Normally, people lie to gain something. But what the disciples got were beatings, exile, torture, and in some cases, death. That doesn't sound like the perks of a good conspiracy theory, does it? They were rejected by Jewish leaders, persecuted by Roman authorities, and lived under constant threat. Why would these people invent a story that brought them suffering and social disgrace instead of comfort and status? Also, if the disciples stole the body, why in the world would James and Paul have been converted? James and Paul did not believe in Jesus before he died, so why would they believe in him after he died? If the disciples were making up a resurrection story, they made odd and counterproductive choices. For instance, they made women the first witnesses, yet in first-century Jewish culture, a woman's testimony was considered unreliable or even worthless. If it were a mere fabrication, they would have likely made it easier to believe, instead of it being a in-time resurrection, which is something that clashed with both Jewish and Greco-Roman expectations. Oddities like this were also included in the disciples' writings, such as their Messiah, Jesus Christ, dying quicker on the cross than the criminals that were on his right and left. These embarrassing details make this history more reliable because normally people make up things that make them look better, not worse. Let's briefly return to James and Paul. Even if the disciples created a conspiracy, it would not explain why James or Paul believed, and it doesn't explain the explosion of Christianity in the region in which Jesus was publicly crucified. The scholar Reginald H. Fuller notes the following, and I quote, "Even the most skeptical historian must postulate some sort of powerful transformative experience to account for the disciples' belief in the resurrection." End quote. Without a true resurrection, it seems that Christianity would have been unlikely to get off the ground. Therefore, the evidence shows that the conspiracy theory is no more than a modern-day conspiracy to avoid the fact of the resurrection. In the end, all of these naturalistic explanations fall short in either explanatory scope, which illustrates how many of the facts are actually accounted for in the explanation. Explanatory power, which tells us to what degree does the explanation explain each fact individually. We also had ad hocness, that tells us to what extent the explanation was contrived or forced to fit. Next we had plausibility, and it tells us how likely the explanation is given its context. And lastly, we had specificity, which helps us determine if the explanation applies to this specific scenario or virtually any scenario that we could think of. In the next video, we will be analyzing 5 more naturalistic theories to determine how these alternatives actually stack up against the resurrection theory. With that being said, I will see you in the next one.